get started. Parshas Shelach. And what I'd love to do today with everyone is a classic commentary on this passage. It's very often quoted, and this is the commentary that everyone should be aware of in studying this parsha. Everyone should be aware of his approach, and all the other commentaries really stem forth from a discussion of how he reads his sources. And what I'm referring to is the way Rav Moshe ben Nachman, the great 13th century rabbi, who was an expert in interpretation of the Torah, an expert in the Talmud, an expert in theology, an expert in philosophy, an expert in polemics, an expert in almost every single aspect of Jewish intellectual achievement in the Middle Ages. So let's look at his commentary on the first, the second verse of the portion. The portion says, "Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe lemor." God spoke to Moshe lemor. God spoke to Moses, saying, and we're just going to look at this next verse, and we'll study Nachmanides' commentary on this. So says the pasuk, right? Shelach lecha anashim. Send for yourself men. Send for yourself men. Hold on. Via Suros Eretz Canaan, and search out the land of Canaan. Asher anino selav ne Israel, that I am giving to the children of Israel. Ish echad l'matei avosav. Tishlachu kol nasibahem. One man from his father's tribe shall you send. Every one of them shall be a prince. So there's a basic problem. And Nachmanides is going to raise many questions about it, or several questions. But even before we begin to look at it, there's another version of this story which we should point out. And the other version of the story is that the spies are not sent, that the Jewish people do not receive a command from God to send out the spies, but they come up with it. They're the one who requested it. As it says in hold on one second, let me just say it right here. In verse 22, it states, "Vatikravun alai kolchem." You all came close to me. Vatomru nishlacha anashim lefaneinu. And when you said, "Let us send men before us," v'yachperu lanu es haaretz, and they'll scout out the land, and they'll bring us back the matter, and they'll tell us how to go in. And Moshe says the idea was good in his eyes. So the fundamental question is, in our portion in Parsha Shelach, it says that God commanded them to go and scout out the land, to send spies. And in Devarim, Moshe says that you came to me, the people came to Moshe and asked if they could send out spies. That's the first fundamental contradiction. The second contradiction is that if God told them to send out the spies and spy out the land, why were they punished for doing essentially what God asked them to do? God asked them to do this. So why are they being punished for this? So let's read the commentary of Ramban, and let's see his questions. But those are the basic questions. I mean, how come they're being punished for doing what God told them to do? God didn't say, go out and only bring back a good report. That's not what God said. God said, go out and scout out the land. So why are they being punished? So let's first read the Rashi. First read the Ramban, quoting the Rashi. Rashi says, send forth men lida'atcha. Why does it say you shall send forth men? Meaning by your own decision. Rashi right away says that the text here in Parashat Shelach does not mean what it says. It says in the text, you should send out men. And Rashi says, no, it doesn't mean you should send out men. It means since you want to send out men, I'm going to allow you to do it. Ani eini mitzavecha. I'm not commanding you. Even though the text reads as a commandment, Rashi says, I'm not commanding you. If you want to send out men, you are allowed to do it. Because Rashi says, what's the controlling text? The controlling text is the text in Deuteronomy, where the children of Israel came and they said to Moshe, let us send out men ahead of us. And that's how Rashi has the two texts which are in conflict, and Rashi favors the text of Deuteronomy. And he says that's what happened. And here God said, if you want to send out the men, you should say I'll allow you. But it just skips the whole part of them asking here. And the only reason we know that is because later on it includes it. As it states, you approach me and say, let us send out men. And Moshe, Nimrach b'shchina, Moshe consulted with God. And God said, Ani amarti lahem shehi tova. I told them already the land was good. Because I said, I'll bring you out from the affliction of Egypt to a good land. I swear that I'm giving to you a place to make a mistake. I'm giving you room to learn your own mistakes through the words of the spies so that they won't take possession of it. Meaning to say, the people, according to Rashi, the reason why the people asked that the whole concept of scouting out the land was the people's concept. They wanted to know if the land was good. And their request was improper. Because God said, I'm giving you a good land. So why are they looking to see if it's good? So that's the way Rashi reads it. There never should have been a request in the first place. The people should have known that the land was good because God told them it was good. That's the first approach. And this is Rashi's approach, and it's totally based upon the Talmud Sota 34b. Ramban has several questions from Rashi's approach. There's several things that Ramban is bothered by. So, first, Ramban writes, we have a question here. If Moshe himself, if you're reading this correctly, the way Rashi's reading it, then in Cain, Moshe atzmo chata binyan. Moshe himself committed a sin because it states in Deuteronomy that when they came to Moshe with the request, it says, Vayitav be'enai hadavar. The matter was good in my eyes. So if Moshe is saying the matter was good in his eyes, that means, and if you're saying the whole request was a sin because they shouldn't have asked to see if the land was good, because they should have known it was good, then Moshe himself sinned. And this is a problem because there's zero hint here, zero hint in Parsha Shelach, in our Parsha, that Moshe did anything wrong. So Rashi's approach is saying, the implication of Rashi's approach is that Moshe did a sin, but nowhere in the text does it support the concept that Moshe sinned. And why did Moshe say, and also furthermore, according to this approach, when it says in our portion in verse Yutet, in verse 19, Moshe says, actually, it says in verse 19, let me just pull up the text. It says, tell me about the land. Is it good or is it bad? Is it good or bad? But according to this approach, Moshe is committing a big sin because God already told him that the land is good. So why is Moshe telling the people, go tell us if the land is good or bad? Moshe himself should have known that the land was good. So the first basically compounded question is, according to your approach, that it was the people's idea to send forth spies. That's Rashi's approach. Well, then Moshe himself should have sinned and should have considered to sin. And nowhere does it say that this was the sin of Moshe. So that's the first problem. Number two is Ramban raises several other questions. I would say at least three major questions. And the first one is, Va'od. Furthermore, me asu hamaraglim. What really was the problem with what the spies did, or the scouts, whatever you want to call them? Well, let's just call them Meraglim. Ki Moshe Amarim, wasn't it Moses who said to them, Re'isem es haaretz mahi, go look at the land, see how it is. Look at the people who dwell there. Are they strong or are they weak? Ham'atu imrav, are they few or numerous? And he said, tell me about the cities. Are they open or fortified? Isn't it their job to respond to what he asked them to do? He said, go tell me about the land. Go tell me about the people. Are they strong or weak? Tell me about the cities. Moshe was the one who told them to do that. So if that's the case, what is their sin, says Rabban? Ma pisham, ma chatatam, when they said, Ki oza ama yoshev haaretz ve'arim b'tzurot gedolot mod. What is their sin when they said the people there are very strong and the cities are very fortified? So, and this is his language. He says, "V'chi al menat sheya'idu lo sheker shalach otam." Did Moshe send them there just to bring back falsehoods and lies? Aren't they under a responsibility? Don't they have a fiduciary, not fiduciary, obviously, but don't they have a responsibility to be good reporters? What was their problem? What was their sin? This is the first of the three major questions that the Ramban asks. What was the sin of the spies? Moshe sent them out. They reported back what they saw. And don't say, says Ramban. Ramban said he's going to negate a possible answer. Don't say that their sin was when they said it's an eretz ochelet yoshveh. Don't say their sin was that it's a land that eats its inhabitants. Because Kalev interrupted them even before they said that. Because we have to read the text here carefully. The Ramban says even before they started slandering the land and said it's a land that eats its inhabitants, which is clearly a lie, but they were already had to be silenced by Kalev. Because they said in verse 32 is when it first starts to say they gave out dibat haaretz, that they gave out slander about the land. And they said it's a land that eats its inhabitants. But even before that, in verse 30, when up until now they just reported facts, it says, and Kalev vayahas Kalev et am el Moshe. And Kalev silenced the people to Moses. So that's the first thing. What did the spies do wrong? And also, it says in Deuteronomy, it says, our brothers melted our hearts, saying that they were a people that was greater and taller than us. And here it states, when Paul Bacharav Nashenu Vitapenu you of us. So that's the first question. What did they do wrong when they came back with their report? Weren't they just listening to Moses? Okay, second question. The second question. Hold on one second. Okay, the second question is, V'nei Moshe amar l'vneihem kedvar meila. Now, the second question is, Moshe speaks like this actually to the next generation of the Bnei Israel. And he, in fact, Moshe Rabbeinu accentuated the strength of the people and the fortifications of their cities and the strength of the giants. And he does that more than the spies actually did. If you look at the later speech of Moshe Rabbeinu in Deuteronomy chapter 9, I'll read it to you. Listen to what Moshe Rabbeinu says in Deuteronomy chapter 9. What does Moshe say? He says as follows. He says, Shema Yisrael, listen Israel, you are passing over today the Jordan to inherit this great nation that is mightier than you. Arim gedolot uvitzurot b'shamayim. There are large cities, fortified towards the heavens. They're an Am Gadol Varam, a mighty nation, children of giants that you know about and you've heard about them. And who can stand before them? Who can stand up against the descendants of a giant? So what did the spies say, which Moshe didn't say? Moshe himself said these. Moshe himself said that they're very strong, they're mighty, children of giants. So what in fact was so bad about what the spies said? So that's the second question. And Nachmanides emphasizes it. If the sin of the spies, if this was the sin of their spies, that they were emphasizing the superior might of the natives of the land, then why would Moshe do the same thing with their children as they were about to enter into the land at the end of 40 years in the wilderness? So far we've seen two questions. Question number one: why are the people being punished if God told them to do it? And if Rashi is correct that actually it was Moshe's, and actually we've seen three questions so far. The first question is, if their sin was that they went and asked God to do this, they should have known that it was good. Well, then Moshe did the same thing. Why isn't he viewed as having sinned? Number two, why are they being punished for bringing back a report that was an honest report? Didn't Moshe send them off with the idea that they would bring back an honest report? Did he send them off just to lie? So why are they being punished? And if you're going to say that they're being punished for fear-mongering, well, Moshe himself was a fear-monger, if that's the case, because he also speaks in this type of language before he dies in Deuteronomy. And so now we come to a third question. And the third question is, why didn't Moshe even bother with this mission? If the land was good and the people were weak, fine. But if the land was bad and the people were strong, what's the plan B here? Is Moshe going to take them back to Egypt? Obviously not. So therefore, the question is, why? What's the purpose of this mission? They're not going back to Egypt anyways. They only have one way. Like they burnt the ships behind them. There's no turning back. So that's the fourth question that we're dealing with at this time. Again, the first question is, if the problem was asking to do this mission, then Moshe also sinned. Second question is, why are the spies being punished for bringing back a factual report? And the third question, if you're going to say they're punished for their fear-mongering, well, then Moshe was also a fear-mongerer in Deuteronomy. And finally, what was the purpose of this mission? If, in fact, they didn't like the land, they weren't going back to Egypt. So they had no alternative. So they might as well go in. So these are four questions at the beginning of Nachmanides' commentary. Let me pause for a second, see if anybody has any answers to this question. Okay, so Ramban says as follows. He says, Yeshuva Inyan, the resolution of this matter is that Ki Yisrael Amru Kederach Kol Abayim La'Lachem Beretz Nachriya. Their first approach was like whatever any nation does before you go into battle. You send in your reconnaissance team to figure out how to attack, how to invade. And in fact, later on in the book of Joshua, Joshua sends forth men, and there's no issue. You have to send men ahead, says Nachmanides, to search out the roads and the best way to conquer the city. Ukeshuvam, and after they return, and this way they come back, and when they come back, when they're ready to invade, these people stand at the front of the lines and show the army which way to go. as it states in Judges that they said, the house of Joseph spied out Bethel, and they saw the man, and they said to him, show us the passage into the city, especially if these were walled cities, you had to know how to get in. They'd show us how to get in. And so these 12 spies were sent to give them advice, which city should they attack first, and from which direction they should fight, which direction would be easiest to conquer the land. And in fact, it says that explicitly. It says, Vayashivu osanu davar es haderech asher naleba ve'es ha'arim asher navo aleim. And they brought us back. They brought us back. It says that in Deuteronomy. They brought us back and they told us how to invade. So they did that part of the task. They went in with the understanding that their job was to tell Bnei Israel how to invade. They went in and they did it. And this is exactly what they should have done. This was the proper strategy. For everyone who wants to conquer a land, you need intel. And these people were sent out to provide intel. Question is, really, if that was their purpose, who sends? You don't send the princes of each tribe, like the equivalent of like senators. You don't send senators on a spy mission. I mean, maybe you do, but I wouldn't think that they'd be the most effective spies. You send the Mossad agent, who we don't even know who they are, and we'll never know. So, and then it continues, and this is in fact what Moshe himself did. It later on in it says that when they attacked the city of Yazer, Moshe himself sent out spies. Vayishlach Moshe l'ragel et Yazer. Moshe sent forth people to spy out the land of Yazer. Also Joshua. Vayishlach Yoshua ben Nun min hashitim shnayim anashim meraglim. Joshua sent 2 men out to spy the land. So we see that this concept of just sending out spies was for sure not a sin. That's how you knew how to conquer it and where to enter in from. This is why when it says that in Deuteronomy, it says that the matter was good in my own eyes, of course it was good, because we don't want to always rely upon a miracle. So the idea that we were going to send our own men to give us the intel and not rely on the miracle, that's a good idea, Rabban says. The Torah doesn't want us to rely upon miracles, but the Torah wants us to protect ourselves and to lay ambushes. So that's what they did in many places. But why did Moshe then go and ask for permission from Hashem? Because there was nothing wrong with the request. That let us send forth spies to tell us how to conquer the land. And he said, send forth men, let them spy out the land, and they will get to know it, and they will tell you. And on the basis of their opinions, they're going to give you advice about how to conquer the land. The first answer that Ramban gives is that it was appropriate to ask for spies in order to know how to invade the land. The spies weren't telling us if we should invade the land, but the purpose of the spies, at least the way Moshe understood it, was to tell us how to invade the land. And that is appropriate because even though we had the cloud of glory, and we had Moshe Rabbeinu, and of course we had Hashem, nevertheless, we don't want to rely upon miracles. And in fact, Rashi says, Ramban says, this is how we should read all the verses in this passage. Moshe says, go up in the south. that you should know a knowledge of the people who dwell in the south. No, basically goes through all these verses, which I don't have to read. He's basically, Ramban reads all the verses. It says, go up in the south, go up in the city. He's basically telling us how to attack, telling Bnei Israel how to attack and where to attack from. And when it says, is it good or is it bad? It doesn't mean if the land is good or bad. It means where's the good place to attack? Where would you have good approach? Where would it be a bad approach? It was all a military request. And in fact, Joshua himself was not successful in conquering everyone. And so therefore, this is the first approach. That all of these verses were not commenting on the land itself, but on the trying to look for the best place to attack. Now, Ramban says, okay, remember the third question that we said, like, what's the alternative here? So Ramban writes, V'yitachein, it's possible, this is his theory, it's possible that Moshe, because he knew that the land was so good and rich, as a result of this, he said to them to verify this, so that they would be able to go back and tell everyone. And then they would rejoice and have new strength to go up to the land. Meaning to say, the whole purpose of this mission was like a campaign to get everybody excited for the entry into the land. Once they heard about how great the land was, who would resist? Who would be able to resist? And that's why Moshe said, take from the fruit of the land, so that he wanted everybody to see just how beautiful it was. He wanted the buy-in of everybody. And that's what was going on here. Why did Moshe send them? Not to find out if the land was good or bad, but either because to see how to invade the land, or B, because he was hoping that when they came back with a report about how great the land was, the people would realize that, of course, they should be going in now. Even if there will always be a few negative people, will be severely diminished. And he says, what's the proof that the whole purpose of sending the men was to determine battle strategy, as opposed to really figuring out if the land was good or bad? Because we know that Egypt is only a 7-day travel from Hebron. That's what Rashi says. And the land of Canaan comes very close to Egypt. And so it's really impossible that the people who lived in Egypt didn't know anything about Canaan. How could it be? Like, these are not things only the spies would know. How could people not know if the land was good or bad? Of course they'd heard about this land. But the intent of Moshe was to know how to conquer the land. And so that's basically Ramban's first approach. Meaning to say, they came to Moshe and asked, and as a result, Moshe said, great idea, let's look how to conquer the land. But now Ramban deals with the second question. The second question is, Ramban writes, the people in Egypt were working with hard labor, but as a result of this, they didn't know the basic information about Canaan. And so therefore, Moshe wanted that the spies would come back and give them all the land, because many of the people there were like day laborers. They didn't know anything about it. So this was just to give them some inspiration. That was his plan. obviously backfired. But that was the plan of Moshe. Now, Ramban challenges the idea that Moshe asked permission from Hashem. And he says, it seems to me, unlike Rashi, who says Moshe asked permission from God, it seems to me, he says that Moshe did not ask permission from God. So if that's the case, why does the pasuk say, "Send forth for yourselves, men," which means to hint to the fact that his commandment was a commandment from God. So it says Ramban, the meaning of "send forth for yourself, men" is that the people had come already to the decision to send forth spies. And really, they should have sent 2 spies, which is what Joshua did. And they should have sent spies, not only 2, but they should have sent it from the battle class, not from the princes of the community. So if that's the case, why they send all 12 and not 2? So writes Ramban, Ki chafetz Hashem wanted that they should have equality in all matters. We don't want to have any one specific person given the responsibility of invading the land. So Hashem wanted that everybody should be involved in looking at the land, not just the spies from one specific tribe. And if the worst thing would happen, which is if they wouldn't agree to God, then, as I asked, this question was only 10, but it was a representative of each tribe. And so therefore, that would be appropriate that they're punished because it came from everyone. So basically, according to this approach, Moshe sent the spies independently without bringing it up with God. But God, how does God react to Moshe's request? So here's what Ramban says. Ramban writes, and it appears to me, according to the simple reading of the verse, Ki lo iskir Hashem Moshe she'elatam sheshalu l'shloch meraglim lo haskamat Moshe mehem. It seems that God, in speaking to Moshe here, never mentioned the request that the people had submitted to him to send to the spies. And it doesn't mention Moshe's agreement. Because if it would have mentioned it, it would have said Moshe agreed or he disagreed. But rather, what's going on here is that the Jewish people requested to send forth spies to the land, and Moshe thought it was a good idea, because that's what he says in Deuteronomy. And the matter was good in my eyes. And what's the reason? How do you interpret this phrase? Vayasur Teretz Canaan asher anino say of Bnei Israel, and they should scout out the land that I'm giving to the land of Israel. That is a new matter. That doesn't relate back to the previous verse. The whole purpose of this was for Hashem desires righteousness. As the verse says, Ramban writes, so that the mission should be carried out and all the tribes will remain great and they'll be saved from calamity. Basically, according to Nachmanides, his answer is that the Jewish people were correct in asking for this request, and really the mission should have been carried out by all the leaders, and they should have been saved. But Ramban also explains that Hashem's instruction to Moshe was a new command. So in addition to saying that the people requested it, it was also a command of Moses. Is what he writes. And he says, they asked from Moshe, let's send forth men and search out the land. And that means searching out the crossroads. As it states, Misham Chafar Ochal. That's what it says, let us go ahead of us, that they will follow behind the spies on the road. So, okay. Finally, Ramban concludes this classic Rashi, this classic commentary, with the following approach. So he said, here in here in Book of Numbers, it says just to spy out the land, but there it's not talking about there it's only referring to the conquest of the land. And it's saying, since you asked. But in Deuteronomy, Moshe told the full story, meaning here we get the abridged version, in Deuteronomy we get the full version. You would think it should be the opposite, that here we should have the full version and Deuteronomy the abridged version. And that's what's normally the case, but it's not the case in this way, and this one time. And that's to tell them of their sins. Moshe was telling them of their sins, and that actually asking for it, according to Ramban, he writes here, was a sin. Really, there was nothing asking for it. It was inappropriate for the people to request this. But then Ramban says that's his approach, that they did nothing wrong with asking, and he really doesn't get into their sin yet. He hasn't gone into it yet. But before he goes to give the answer, he says, according to the rabbis, they never should have asked. But Ramban totally disagrees with that. He says they should have asked. He should have asked because they needed to scout out the land. So he really hasn't fully explained what their sin was. So we have to go later on in this commentary of Ramban and explain what the actual sin was according to Ramban. So hold on one second. Basically, we're not going to have time to read the whole Ramban here, but let me point out what Ramban says is there are two major problems. First of all, we go back to Elaine's approach. And Ramban writes in his commentary the following. He says, in all this, they said the truth, and they gave answers about what they were told to investigate. So what was their sin? They had to respond truthfully. Yesh lehem lashev imrei emes l'shocham. That's what God commanded. You have to speak the truth. And they were asked that question. So this is the word. Goes to what Elaine was saying. Haya risham b'milat efes. Their whole sin, according to Ramban, was one word. What was the one word? When they said, in verse. Hold on, what's the verse? Their whole word, it was their sin in verse 28. After they described the land and they said, Ephes, it's worthless because these people are too strong. It's worthless because these people are too strong. Shehi moral davar Ephes. The word was Ephes because that indicates something that we're not capable of doing. Their whole sin was in effect saying, it's an impossibility, not believing in the possibility of Hashem and in their own ability to do something that God told them that to do. So that was their sin. Their sin was not in bringing back a bad report. And according to Ramban, yes, eventually they started lying, but at the beginning they weren't lying, but they had still sin. And their sin was not believing in the confidence to do something. And that is really the sin of low self-esteem. They didn't believe they were capable. Elsewhere, Ramban,
Rabbi?
hold on one second. Elsewhere, Ramban says the Ramban says that they had another problem. The Ramban says, we saw the giants, and we were in their eyes like locusts. We were like grasshoppers in their eyes. Now, how are they going to know how other people viewed them? How did they know that? That too goes back to this sin of low self-esteem. And that's, I guess, you ask, like, what is the message here? The message here is, if God creates us, and God obviously not if, God created us with our superpowers to be great and tells us we could do something. And if we say FS, EF that's the sin of the spies, to say we can't do what God told us we could do. Let me stop, Elaine. Let's hear what your